Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations, where we believe when you communicate better, you live better. As always, I'm Chris, one of your co hosts, and I own Leadership Potential, where I'm passionate about ending accidental leadership. And as always, I'm joined by Lucie, owner of Mindfittery.
Which is mental fitness gym for leaders, their teams, and even their families.
And today we are having such an important conversation, but I think this is a cool conversation that we don't always talk about either on this podcast or I think in the mainstream. I think it's worth talking about kind of how are we equitably treating the people around us and helping people to also advocate for each other and around the world. So today we are excited to talk with Gift Tshuma, a really fun guy, a really knowledgeable guy. I learn a lot every time we talk, and I'm glad that we were able to get connected by Julianne, another guest that we've had recently. But he works as an advocacy specialist at March of Dimes in Canada, and he's also co-executive director of Blurring the Boundaries, focusing on advocacy for the disabled population. Gift, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us, you wear a lot of different hats. You do this, and also you do freelance consulting and contracting also. All of this around advocacy around people with disabilities. What drew you to this work? What makes you passionate? When you were growing up, were you like, I want to do this for a living?
I actually never decided to do this for a living.
Hmm.
It kind of like happened accidentally, if I'm to be honest with you. What drew me to this work is both, personal and practical. As a person with a physical disability, I grew up, navigating systems that weren't built with my body or my needs in mind. And I learned very quickly that access isn't something that you're just given. It's not served on a silver platter. You have to fight for it, and you have to sometimes build it yourself. If fighting for it is not enough, and doing both those things, over time it turned into a career where I work for multiple nonprofit organizations and running a consulting business on equity and accessibility. That's how things kind of unfolded, and uh, you know I've always had this lens of that advocacy isn't charity work. It's not about being a hero. It's more about shifting the power and building disability literacy. It's about uh, making sure that people with disabilities actually have influence over the decisions that actually shape their lives.
Mm. And let me just let's take a sideways step first. For people listening, advocacy is such a hot topic word. People use it all the time. How would you define advocacy?
Ooh, okay. I'd say it's telling a story. It's telling a story to decision makers. It's telling a story on what you want them to do or what you don't want them to do. That's in the very simplest form I would explain advocacy is telling a story and trying to convey to the audience, which are the decision makers, and you're telling them what they should do or what they shouldn't do. And that's how you affect that change. That's in the very simplest form of how I would define it.
And were you always comfortable with sharing your story or trying to persuade people to behave a certain way or do certain things?
Absolutely not. It was a very incremental growth. I'd say it started with, advocating for myself from a social perspective, just for me to be seen as me and not to be seen as different or not to be seen as, an outsider because of how I look or how I talk. And that's pretty much how I would say I started. It was advocating for myself in a social setting And that quickly grew to expand into, other environments such as workplace, education, policy work, government, etc.
You were able to advocate for yourself and have that voice. What would you say might stop people from advocating for themselves?
Fear, the fear of getting the answer of saying no, fear of being rejected. We all hate rejection in whatever form that comes. And I'd say people, yeah, they just feel, like the fear of being rejected and feel that maybe they don't have the voice or that their voice doesn't carry any influence or power or authority, right? And I believe that, when we dismantle all of that and we just look at it from a very simple perspective of like, look, I'm just telling my story. I'm telling my truth. I'm telling what my reality is and what people within my community are experiencing. And I want that change. Then people start to realize, okay, I do have a story to tell. Yes, I do, have the power to advocate for myself and for those within my community. That's pretty much what I would tell them.
What do you think of the tension of advocating for yourself versus having somebody else advocate for you?
Hmm. I'm glad that there's a pushback on like, advocate for stuff and then those advocating for me. Um, because I truly believe people with disabilities can and do advocate for themselves. Um, and I think that it's important for me to highlight that the issue isn't capacity, it's access, the issue is safety, and the issue is power. So a lot of people can speak up, but they get ignored, they get dismissed, they get, rejected and, or they get reprimanded or more for a simpler term, like punished for what they do or say. Um, and I take my role, as an advocate or even as a professional in advocacy, uh, less more of as like speaking for someone, but more as like kind of trying to redistribute influence. And what that actually means in a very like practical sense is amplifying people's voices. And sometimes the way that looks like is stepping back and changing the system so that, their voice can actually land, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes it may mean, being strategic about, who speaks when, because, the system the system is like a human, right? It's an entity. It's like a person. I view it as a person, and the system will receive information or will listen differently depending on who is in the room, right? So that's kind of like how I figure out how can influence be redistributed, and how can voices land depending on the environment.
Mm. You mentioned something about storytelling, and I'm wondering, I think there's a lot of tension for a lot of people. They often feel like, how can I tell my story? Nothing, my story is nothing special. There's other people that have had it either harder or they have more interesting stories. How do you respond to people who maybe don't have confidence in their own stories or like the power that their own story can bring to the conversation?
Absolutely. Um, this will sound harsh. I always tell, people that, when you are not telling your story, you are robbing someone for their life to be changed, right? When you tell your story, you're empowering someone. You may meet that person, you may not meet that person, but when you tell that story, you are going to empower someone, at least one person. So it's all about doing something that is greater than ourselves. And how do you do that? Build the skills, practice with your community. Look at the issues that you care about and and look at how are they affecting other people within that community. So if I look at transportation, for example, I would look at, okay, how is transportation affecting people with physical disabilities in Canada, right? And I see that, oh, there are many stories that have been published around this. Let me give my perspective from the East Coast side, or let me give my perspective as a person who is a person of color, right? So those are the nuances that make our stories unique and
Mm-hmm.
that much more powerful.
Mm. Do you, and have you seen that kind of comparison? Like I sometimes feel like people get into an internal like suffering Olympics or an oppression Olympics of like
Mhm.
who's had it worse, whose experience like matters more, quote unquote. Do you run into that ever?
Absolutely. I think it's in every sphere, sadly, like who's had it worse and whose voice deserves to be heard, you know. But I think that we all have a seat at the table, and we all have a lane where our voice would have more of an impact than another environment. It's just you need to find your tribe, you need to find your audience, and it will land for those particular people.
How would you find your tribe?
The internet is a beautiful place. There's tons of like Facebook groups, tons of LinkedIn groups, and even organizations that will align with your ethos, right? And if you're not into like national organizations or well-established institutions, and let's say a student, like look at even like grassroots groups, right? Those may align more with your values and what you believe in. And yeah, the internet is your friend. Just see what people are talking about, and you will find that tribe that you can call a family.
And earlier you also mentioned, the importance of kind of influencing people in the room so that they'll include you. How have you approached different different groups and how they might view people with disabilities differently or the same as other groups that don't necessarily get enough representation, whether it's
Hmm.
based on race, age, gender, all that kind of stuff.
I'm gonna go back to my analogy of advocacy is like telling a story, right? When you're telling a story, you need to know your audience. You need to know the language that they speak, right? So if I'm speaking to corporate audience or I'm speaking to a nonprofit with the corporate audience, I will talk about, let's say, employment equity. Why is it beneficial for them? Not why is it good for society or why is it equitable, but I'll look at like why is it beneficial for you? Because in a corporate world, it's all about cost and benefit analysis. It's all about profit. So you need to speak that language like this will profit you more if you hire people from these backgrounds because they'll bring in a perspective that you wouldn't have with this demographic of people, whether it's someone with a disability or someone without a disability, and someone with other intersecting identities, right? So it's essentially knowing what language would be best received by the audience you are just talking to. So yeah, just know your audience well, and other audiences may require for you to speak in corporate lingo or plain language or scholarly language. So it's just know your audience so that your message can land in a way that's effective and meaningful for you.
So, based on that, I assume there would be different conversations one could have within an organization. Let's say different language or different story or different angle to use with colleagues versus, let's say, with the leadership. What are the most common conversations, the difficult conversations people might have with colleagues or leadership
Hmm.
around accessibility?
There's a few. That's a very good question. Thank you, Lucy. You're making my head itch a little bit.
People tell me that.
You know, I wish I could actually scratch my head physically, but I'm just imagining it right now. So, anyways, yeah, I'd say the difficult conversations that are happening, frequently within organizations. You're gonna hear, phrases. There's quite a pattern. There's quite a pattern, and you're gonna hear phrases like, "We don't have a budget for that." Um, you know, like we already received so many complaints. We're trying to get through it, or our policies don't allow for that. And sometimes you may even hear something that looks like it's a collaborative effort. They'll say, let's start with something small and realistic, and take it from there. Um, and it's sad, it's sad that a lot of organizations hide behind policy and legality, instead of engaging with a real human impact. They often treat compliance as like a playbook, as like the finish line, instead of as the foundation or the starting point. And they they like to default to palatable access solutions, often the ones that look good in public, on social media posts, or the ones that look good on a slide deck. So what I'm often like, advocating for or arguing about in these organizations, it's not like physical wraps, it's not softwares or things that need to be changed physically about the environment. I'm often, arguing about, you know, um, whose time matters, whose comfort level
Mm.
matters, whose productivity is treated as a default, and whether accessibility is you know whether it's something they actually value, or just something they will do when it's convenient for them. For example, in November there's often the International Day for Persons with Disabilities, and you'll see a lot of corporations and organizations speaking very highly about inclusion and hiring people with disabilities and such. So those are the kind of difficult conversations I have with organizations, is that they they're having a difficult time in understanding on whose time matters and whose voice really matters, and what issues are more important than the black and white, the A equals B solution. They have difficult time understanding the nuances of access, or the nuances of inclusion.
Mm. You said something so interesting before that I hadn't heard before, that
Mhm.
leaders will tend to hide behind, like, it's gonna cost too much, or they're hiding behind compliance or the fiscal stuff. And, if you I think a lot of leaders do look at that fiscal stuff, and they usually use that as the core belief. But I think it's a great point that that may not be the real reason why they're really, um, fighting it. Is that inner belief of, "I don't wanna change for whatever reason." How do
It's a
you
very easy Happy Meal drive-through, solution.
Yeah, how do you, like, in your experience, how do you kinda dig through that to help unearth what's the real resistance, or what's causing the real resistance?
I I'm a huge supporter of like studying what their purpose and vision is. Use that as your tool to get to where you're trying where you're trying to help them understand. So look at the purpose and their vision statements, read their policies and know their policies. Advocacy, it requires work. It's not about just like saying like, I need this, you should do this because it's the right thing to do. It's like doing you're basically an investigator. You are also an orator. And you are also unofficially a lawyer because you have to study policies and laws to really like get your point across because the decision makers will always use policy and legality around it. And finding those like, gaps within those policies often goes a long way to getting your point across. And that's the approach I take is I take time to study. I take time um, to know like where are they and where the sort of uh, pitfalls within those legalities or within those policy statements.
Mm. So the storytelling you were talking about, the advocacy is storytelling and
Mhm.
sharing your own story. That's just like the first part of it. That's like that's
That's
the
the
foundation, but
baseline.
you got to do the rest of the stuff too.
Yes, yes. So when you're telling your story, you also need to know yourself, right? You need to know how will this impact me if I don't see the change that I want materialized, right? You gotta know how's this affecting other people within your community. Um, so that's just the baseline, and that's just to get you comfortable to know this story in your sleep, right? For you to recite it, because the nerves get the better, the better of us. Unfortunately, when you're speaking to people for authority, you may blank up. You may forget like everything you want to say, or you may not even sound as persuasive as you were hoping to be. And that's perfectly normal. But like when you take this like storytelling approach and you practice it with your peers and such, then you are ready to do the harder work of like research, of like analyzing some of the holes within, you know, uh, within those policies or legalities.
Oh, that sounds like a lot of work and effort and wearing multiple hats.
It
W-
is.
When somebody hears that and they feel like, oh my God, this is so much. I already am struggling, let's say, with my own energy. How do I get energy to even do all that? What would be, and they feel overwhelmed. What would be something that might be the 20% that they could do that could provide for the 80% of the results? The most important thing
Hmm.
to
Absolutely.
advocate for themselves.
Absolutely. And I don't want people to get the wrong impression here that, I built the skills like over time. As I kind of like alluded to this in the beginning briefly, it started from a social level where I was advocating for myself in the classroom, in elementary school, in high school, and college, and I was advocating myself with teachers and friends, my peers, like just for me to belong or for me to be heard, right?
Mm.
And I was able to sharpen those skills in in a lower stake environment. And then as I got older and as I was like, maturing and like getting to form my critical thoughts and such, and like, going to university, that's when like I started to build those other skills, like, related to policy, related to legality and reading the room and, understanding my audience and such. Like all of this took time. It was over a period of a few years. So I'll just say, start with lower stakes environment and then slowly build yourself up. And if the issue that, you want to address is at a very high stake level, there's nothing wrong with getting an ally, someone who's comfortable with policy analyzation or someone who's comfortable with that. Get an ally to join forces with you. Because, as human, we're not, you know, we're not meant to do things alone. We are community based, you know, beings that need support from everyone. And I do also have, allies and communities that I lean on in areas where I don't feel so confident in. So don't be ashamed to ask for help. It's really key, and I can't stress that enough.
What
No,
about the person that's, they've been trying to do the work. They're following these steps and they're feeling beaten down. Like they've just been doing it for a little bit and they're just getting so much pushback or they're not making a ton of progress and they're feeling kind of disheartened and overwhelmed maybe by it all. What are you saying to them in that space?
Form a coalition. Started, get a group of friends and people to join with you, and there's power in numbers, right? Like there's power if you're raising the same issue with 20 other people or with 10 other people, that will have a greater impact, right? I'd say do that. Use media as your tool to initiate pressure, right? Media, it goes a long way when it comes to, you know, uh, you know, amassing some sort of influence. So use tools like that, media, social media as well, and group of people to help support your cause.
I'm wondering, as I heard you talk about you advocating for yourself since elementary school, I cannot even imagine. It might have been also taking a lot of internal resilience, let's say to get pushback, to get rejection. What would you say helped you personally deal with kind of the internal emotional tools that helped you not give up, but continue advocating and developing those skills even when you got rejected?
Absolutely. That's a very good question. Okay, I'll give an example of something that I advocated for um, in high school. I went to a high school that didn't have students with disabilities. And our lunch cafeteria was not wheelchair accessible, which meant that I ate my lunch, in the hallway or ate it in the classroom of a teacher, and that affected my social experience, my social, my socialization with other students. And I brought this up to the principal, and I said, hey, like, I being in school is not all about education. It's also about, the social experience, the connections that you have with other peers. And I think it's important that we build a ramp, for this cafeteria so that not only me, but other students who come before me will have, will not experience what I'm experiencing, not being able to connect with others during break time. Um, and I was even candid about the impact this was having on my mental health. Um, that this is creating an other. Teachers understand because all they're trying to do is they're trying to create a generation that's aware. They're trying to create a generation that's empathetic and intelligent. And when you are bringing a conversation from that lens, it really lands deeply with them. And eventually, the career was made accessible. But in terms of like what kept me grounded is um first and foremost is like my faith. Like I'm very spiritual. Um like much of my faith like really helped me stay grounded. And also I'm an artist. I write music, I write songs. So
Mhm.
like using that as an outlet to deal with some of the emotional toll helped a great deal. And then I'd say in the latter years of my high school, I was more open to therapy, to the concept of therapy, and that helped a great deal. So I'd say those three things is what kept me grounded.
Thank you for sharing.
Gift, would you be open to doing a couple of just role play scenarios?
Absolutely.
All right, that's the end of part one of our interview with Gift. Stay tuned for next week when we jump back into it.